Darkcast Network, bringing our indie podcasts out of the shadows. Trigger warning. This episode talks about suicide and features some strong language, so listener discretion is advised.
Welcome, wee ones, to Scottish Murders. Dawn will shortly be taking you through a solved or unsolved murder involving people from or living in Scotland. So get ready to hear about the darker side of bonnie Scotland.
In the days following 23-year-old Nicola McDonough and her 52-year-old mother, Margaret McDonough, being found unconscious in the corridor and bedroom of a Premier Inn in Greenock on the 9th of May 2013, newspaper headlines read, "Hotel Death, Mother Found Near Injured Daughter." Then, "Hotel Deaths, Daughter Dies Days After Mother." Then, "Daughter Injured in Attack at Greenock Hotel Dies." And then, "Hotel Mother and Daughter in Suicide Pact." So what had begun as a suspected attack on Nicola and her mother Margaret within days had turned into a suicide pact being suspected, with the police saying that they weren't looking for anyone else being involved. However, after a year of investigating the circumstances surrounding the deaths, on the 4th of May 2014, a report about activities related to the deaths was referred to the Procurator Fiscal in Greenock, and a 31-year-old woman was named in connection with alleged incidents that took place between May 2012 and May 2013. Then, on the 10th of May 2014, 31-year-old Lindsay Cotton was arrested and charged over the suspected double suicide of mother and daughter Margaret and Nicola McDonough. So, was this an attack or a suicide pact? And if it was a suicide pact, what had led a mother and daughter to make such a pact together? And who was Lindsay Cotton, the 31-year-old woman who had been named in the report to the Procurator Fiscal, who, according to Wikipedia, is a public prosecutor in Scotland, and then arrested and charged? And what activities related to the deaths was the report alluding to? To find the answers to these questions, we'll need to go back to May 2012, a year before Margaret and Nicola were found unconscious. 31-year-old Michael McDonough had a fantastic career as a Royal Air Force corporal based at Lossiemouth in Moray, which he loved. However, his love life was not as fantastic. And so in August 2011, hoping that he could find someone to share his life with, Michael joined the dating website Plenty of Fish. While Michael had some bites while on the dating website, he hadn't found someone he wanted to begin a relationship with. That was until May 2012, when he received a message from a Stephanie Wilson, whose profile said she was a student at Edinburgh University. Michael liked the sound of this woman and her profile picture, and so he wrote back. And before long, the pair were messaging regularly, eventually exchanging mobile numbers and continuing to speak frequently via text, emails, and phone calls. The pair grew closer and closer, speaking on the phone for hours on an evening, and despite never having met, Michael had fallen for Steph, and he entered into a relationship with her. During one of their many long phone calls, Steph mentioned to Michael that she was having a bit of trouble with her sister's ex-boyfriend, and that he had been known to be violent. Not long after that conversation, Michael received a phone call from a lady claiming to be Steph's mum, saying that the ex-boyfriend of Steph's sister had attacked Steph, and that Steph was in hospital with a bleed on the brain. Michael was shocked and worried and said he would come straight to the hospital, asking where Steph was. However, the mum asked if he would hold off until the family knew more. Michael agreed, but was extremely worried about Steph. However, he wouldn't have long to wait for an update, as he then received a phone call from a Lindsay Cotton, saying she was Steph's best friend and that Steph had been chosen, according to the Scottish Daily Mail in 2015, for a pioneering stem cell trial which was run by a company called Biotech Scotland, which could potentially save Steph's life. While Michael was relieved that Steph was going to be receiving treatment for her bleed on the brain, he desperately wanted to visit her, and he, by now, was absolutely in love with Steph and classed her as his girlfriend. However, Steph's family asked if he would hold off, but Steph's mum, dad, and 3 stepsisters would regularly phone and text Michael to let him know that they had been visiting Steph and how she was doing. Frustrated at not being allowed to visit Steph, when Steph's best friend, Lindsay, called him again, he said more forcefully that he wanted to visit Steph, only to be told by Lindsay that this would be impossible, as Steph was now being moved around many different hospitals regularly for life-saving treatment, and also due to the fact that Steph had signed a strict confidentiality agreement when she had decided to take part in the top-secret stem cell trial. Michael was disappointed, but what choice did he have but to accept what he was being told, and he still could look forward to regular texts and phone calls from Steph. During one of these phone calls, Steph became upset and told Michael that in order to continue to receive the life-saving stem cell treatment, a small amount of money was needed to go towards it, but that her family were unable to come up with this. Michael was desperate to help Steph, and so he offered to pay, but first he wanted to speak to someone who was carrying out this treatment to find out more. Michael then received a call from Lindsay, who said Steph was so grateful he would be able to help with her continuing her treatment, and that she would arrange for someone to call Michael to discuss further. And true to her word, Michael received a phone call, according to an article in the Daily Express, not only from a nurse administering Steph's treatment, Nurse Ashley, but also a Dr. Collins. Following speaking to the medical team, Michael was satisfied and asked who he should pay the money to, at which point he was told that he should speak to Lindsay, as she was Steph's point of contact in this matter. Lindsay was happy to help and asked Michael to transfer the money to her, and she would ensure that the appropriate people received it, thanking him again for his support of Steph and her treatment. While still not being able to visit Steph, Michael looked forward to their now nightly long phone calls. During one phone call, Steph told Michael that it was her birthday coming up, and she was sad that she would have to spend it in hospital. Michael asked her what would help cheer her up, and Steph said that maybe some jewellery would. So Michael told her to pick what she wanted and that he would buy it for her. Steph was delighted and promptly picked out an expensive pendant, which Michael bought for her and gave to Lindsay to take to Steph the next time she visited her. During another of Steph and Michael's nightly phone calls, Steph asked Michael if he would take Lindsay and her 2 children, Jack 8 and Lauren 12, on a holiday, as Lindsay had done so much for Steph and she'd love to do something nice for her. And so Michael took Lindsay and her 2 children for a wee break in Lossiemouth, which, according to lossiemouth.org, is on the Moray coast, approximately 40 miles or 64 kilometres east of Inverness and 70 miles or 112 kilometres northwest of Aberdeen. As the months rolled by and Steph continued to be in hospital having life-saving stem cell treatment, Michael again broached the subject of wanting to see her, willing to do whatever he could to make this happen. Steph agreed that she would like to see him too, and so Michael and Steph said that they would speak to Lindsay and see if this could be arranged somehow. Upon thinking about this, Lindsay felt she'd come up with the perfect way for the pair to possibly see each other, and that was if Michael and Steph said that they were engaged. It might be looked on more favourably by the powers that be if Michael and Steph said this due to the fact that Steph had signed a strict confidentiality agreement. Michael readily agreed with this. However, he then received a text from Steph saying that if he loved her, he would buy her an engagement ring. And so Michael bought Steph a white diamond square ring worth £1,800 or $2,100, which he gave to Lindsay to give to Steph. However, before a visit could be arranged, Lindsay called with some devastating news for Michael. Apparently, one of the doctors at Biotech Scotland had tried to poison Steph with the drugs, going on to say, according to an article in the Scottish Daily Mail in 2015, that the company would receive £100 million or $118 million payout if all the patients in the clinical trial died. with Lindsay claiming that there was a government conspiracy to keep this a secret and out of the media, and that he couldn't tell anyone about this, but that there was an ongoing threat to Steph's life. Due to this, Lindsay explained that she would now be the only point of contact. Michael was devastated, and so despite being told to keep this a secret, he needed to talk to someone, and so he shared this awful alleged cover-up with his family, his mum Margaret, younger sister Nicola, and older brother Kevin, but Michael swore them to secrecy. By this point, Michael's family had met Lindsay. Michael had met Lindsay's children and her mother. He had visited Lindsay and her children at their home in Addywell, a former mining village in West Lothian, for Christmas 2012. He would regularly take Lindsay and her children for days out, and Lindsay was a regular visitor at the McDonough home in Corsbar Avenue in Paisley, about a 53-minute journey west of Lindsay's home, obviously as Steph's best friend, and Michael's only way of finding out how Steph was doing. However, Michael was worried sick about what was happening with Steph and if she may survive the alleged poisoning. And so no longer being able to speak to Steph himself, but only via information from Lindsay, he moved in with Lindsay and her 2 children, just so he could keep up to date with what was happening with Steph and her welfare. But Michael was really struggling. He'd met this woman online who he had fallen in love with, but he'd never met her. She was in hospital and he wasn't allowed to visit her. They had got engaged, but he wasn't able to speak to her, and she now was apparently being poisoned. And this had been going on for many months. And so Michael felt immense stress, and his mental health took a turn for the worse, so much so that he left his post as corporal at the RAF base in Lossiemouth in January 2013. He now spent his time at Lindsay's home with her and her 2 children, speaking with her about Steph and waiting for any information that Lindsay could give him. Michael's family were extremely worried about him and Steph, as they had become to know Steph too, and they cared about her predicament over the previous months. But they felt happy that Michael was with Lindsay, who they had also gotten to know through her friendship with Steph and her visiting their home many, many times with updates about Steph for Michael, and they felt that Lindsay would look out for Michael. But how wrong they were. When Michael was staying with Lindsay and her children, and upon no longer being able to work, he began to do things around the house for Lindsay, such as fixing floorboards and painting and wallpapering her home, and if something in the house needed replacing, such as a washing machine, or if Lindsay mentioned she needed something, such as a new phone, Michael would happily buy these items for her. All the while, the threat to Steph's life hung in the air. And while Lindsay assured Michael that his financial and emotional support of Steph was what was keeping her alive, she continued to say that biotech were preventing him from visiting Steph. The situation with Steph continued, and the situation severely affected Michael's mental health. And then, towards the end of April 2013, Lindsay came up with the idea that intervention from the European Court of Human Rights could potentially help Steph's situation, and thus Michael's. By this stage, Michael was willing to try anything to be able to see Steph, and he agreed. But Lindsay said that it would be more impactful if members of Michael's family would write a letter or testimony to the European Court of Human Rights advising just how severely the situation with Steph was impacting him. Michael said he would ask his mum Margaret and sister Nicola if they would do this, as they and Michael's brother Kevin were well aware of the situation and just how this was affecting Michael and were very concerned about him. Upon Michael explaining to Margaret and Nicola the plan Lindsay had come up with, they both readily agreed that they would write testimonies to the European Court of Human Rights. And after doing this, they gave their testimonies to Lindsay so she could run them past Steph before posting them. However, days later, Nicola received a letter apparently from Steph which claimed that her testimony was not good enough, with the letter going on to read, according to the Scottish Daily Mail, in September 2015, "Your big brother has asked you for help, and it's become apparent you could not be bothered to give it a go. Enjoy your life, Nicola, while I struggle with mine." Nicola was shocked to have received this letter, as was her mum and brother Kevin, but Lindsay had been in touch saying she was coming over. Hopefully she would be able to shed some light on this and put the McDonough family's minds at rest. But no, Lindsay would not be putting their minds at rest. She would be doing the complete opposite. When Lindsay arrived at the McDonough home, she said to the waiting Margaret, Nicola and Kevin that as the secrecy surrounding Steph's stem cell treatment had been breached, which left Steph in mortal danger, and that Margaret and Nicola were to blame, as nobody was allowed to talk about it, let alone write testimonies to the European Court of Human Rights, Margaret and Nicola now faced 20 years in prison. The family were in shock, with Margaret and Nicola being left in tears and terrified at the prospect of being sent to prison. But again, Lindsay had a plan. She told Margaret and Nicola that she knew a couple of solicitors and had spoken to them, and they had told Lindsay that they might be able to make the case disappear and help the family escape prosecution if the family could come up with £5,000 or $6,100. Lindsay said the solicitors had advised her that it was Nicola who likely faced the heaviest prosecution, and so just in case the solicitors were unable to make the case go away, it would be best if Nicola had a fake passport, just as a worst-case scenario, so she could flee the country. And so Lindsay said if the family gave her a further £500 or $610, she would be able to get Nicola a fake passport. Obviously, the McDonough family were in shock. How was this happening to them? They just couldn't take this in. And so Lindsay kindly said she would ask the solicitors, who Lindsay introduced as Callum and Jennifer, to contact the family so they could hear the information from them. The family then received text messages from 2 separate numbers, with Lindsay saying one was from Jennifer and the other was from Callum. During this correspondence, the solicitors told Margaret and Nicola just what serious trouble they were in, and confirmed that they were looking at 20 years in prison. The solicitors, Jennifer and Callum, also said that they had spoken to a Judge Phillips, who they knew they could trust, and he too messaged the McDonough family, telling them just how dire the situation was and that their only hope was to give Lindsay the £5,500 or $6,800, and hopefully the case could be made to disappear. Having dropped this bombshell, before leaving the McDonough family to digest just what they were facing, Lindsay made sure they understood that there really was no option. They had to pay this money or they would be sent to prison. Once Lindsay left, Margaret, Kevin and Nicola were left stunned and in despair and fear of what they were facing, but they dared not discuss their situation with anyone outside of themselves as they feared further repercussions. And so they turned to the only other person that knew everything that had been going on, Michael. However, Michael had been living with Lindsay for months, was deeply in love with Steph, and was already severely affected by all that had taken place. And now, with the confidentiality breached by his family, he was terrified about Steph's safety. And so sadly, Margaret, Kevin and Nicola could not rely on any support or loyalty from Michael, with him saying that he could not forgive his family for what they had done. Michael was already torn between Lindsay and Steph and his family, but when he was receiving messages from Lindsay, which according to the Scottish Daily Records read, "She fucking knew full well what she was doing. I can't forgive your mum, and I want your sister to be punished. That bitch can't be trusted, and she thinks nothing of destroying people's lives. Inside, she's a mess." And messages from Steph which read, "I want revenge on your stupid fucking sister. I want to put her in a fucking prison. She opened her mouth." There was no way Michael was going to see what was really happening before it was too late. With Michael, Kevin, Margaret and Nicola now in a state of fear about their futures, Lindsay kept up the pressure. She continued to text, call and visit the McDonough family and tell them that they had no option but to pay the £5,500 or $6,800 if they didn't want to go to prison, to tell them just how awful prison would be and that Nicola especially would be beaten up repeatedly. And so the best thing they could do was pay the money and go on the run. The family also continued to receive messages from the solicitors, Jennifer and Callum, telling them to pay the money to Lindsay as that was their best option, from Judge Philip, who continued to tell them that they faced 20 years in prison, and even a barrister had begun to message them to tell them paying the money was the best option. While Margaret and Nicola's relationship with Michael was very fraught, they were constantly bombarded by texts and phone calls from Lindsay, Steph, Jennifer, Callum, a barrister, and Judge Philip, and were in a state of absolute fear and desperation until they could see no way out. Margaret McDonough was 52 years old in May 2013. She worked as a foster care worker and was considering adopting a girl aged 2 and a boy aged 5 who she had recently fostered. Margaret and her husband Thomas had separated in 2008 after being together for 28 years, and the breakdown of her marriage and subsequent divorce had hit Margaret hard. She had remained single and hadn't been looking to date anyone else, preferring to put her time and energy into her children and her foster children, although she had stood as a Liberal Democrat council candidate in 2012. Margaret was described as being compassionate and was always keen to care for others. Her 23-year-old daughter, Nicola, also shared Margaret's passion for caring for others and being compassionate, and was not only a charity worker, but had begun studying for a degree in social work, which in April 2013 she had just completed and had already secured an interview for a job. To celebrate completing her degree, Nicola had planned a short summer break with 3 of her university friends to Switzerland, which she was looking forward to, especially as Nicola had recently split up from her long-term boyfriend and was feeling a bit upset about this. So, at the beginning of May 2013, when Margaret and Nicola were put under immense stress and pressure, the pair not only had no partners to turn to or to support them emotionally or financially, they both were still coping with the loss of their long-term relationships and were likely emotionally fragile, which possibly contributed to their belief that there really was no way out of the situation they had found themselves in. Not only did they not have the kind of money that was being demanded of them, but neither woman could face either a life on the run or behind bars. And so when Lindsay visited the 2 women again on Tuesday the 7th of May 2013 and put even more pressure on the women to come up with the money or face the consequences, the pair began to put the only plan they could think of into action. On Thursday, the 9th of May, Margaret and Nicola left the family home and dropped the 2 foster children off at school and nursery. They then drove their Suzuki Swift car to a solicitor's office, also in Paisley, and Margaret signed a will she had had made up in the presence of a solicitor. The will left the family home worth £250,000 or $303,000 to her 3 sons, 33-year-old Kevin, 32-year-old Michael, and 21-year-old Matthew. Margaret also had a car worth about £4,200 or $5,100 and £239 or $290 in the bank. It's unknown what Margaret and Nicola did after that, but when Margaret failed to pick up her foster child from nursery, the alarm was raised, and they were reported missing about 2 p.m. on Thursday the 9th of May. While family members and police were searching for Margaret and Nicola, at 3:50 p.m. on Thursday, the pair checked into a Premier Inn in Greenock, a 36-minute drive northwest of their home in Paisley, for one night. After checking in, the pair went to their room, but then left again shortly afterwards. They then returned to the Premier Inn between 12:30 and 1 a.m. on Friday the 10th of May, where they parked their Suzuki Swift in the car park and headed to their double room. What the pair did upon leaving the Premier Inn shortly after they checked in and upon arriving back at the Premier Inn between 12:30 and 1 a.m. nobody knows for sure, but they had no further contact with their family members, who by this time were very concerned for their safety. It wasn't until 7 a.m. on Friday the 10th of May when Nicola was found by a guest going down for breakfast, slumped against a wall in the corridor of the hotel, unconscious and bleeding profusely from deep slash wounds on her lower arms, that the alarm was raised. Margaret was found shortly afterwards in the nearby hotel room, also unconscious and also with deep slash wounds on her lower arms. At this time, due to their wounds, it was initially believed that the pair had been stabbed, but quickly it was reported that the police weren't looking for a third party, that they were treating the injuries as unexplained, and that it could possibly have been a double suicide. Margaret and Nicola were rushed to hospital, but sadly Margaret died shortly after arriving there. Nicola was in a critical condition and was still unconscious upon arriving at the hospital. Police contacted Margaret and Nicola's family to inform them of what had happened, and Michael and Lindsay were together when he received the call. Family members, including Michael and Lindsay, arrived at the hospital, and it was reported by Sky News that the family were totally baffled as to what had happened. All anyone could do, including the police, was wait by Nicola's bedside and hope that she woke up. But sadly, 3 days later, Nicola died too, with her father Thomas at her side. With Nicola now having also died, it was left to the police to try and find out what had led to this tragedy. Although despite being at Nicola's bedside and appearing shocked and upset, there was one person present who knew exactly what had led to this tragedy: Lindsay Cotton. Despite the police removing Margaret and Nicola's Suzuki Swift car for forensic examination, and despite speaking to family members and friends of Margaret and Nicola, the police were initially unable to uncover anything that could have led to Margaret and Nicola taking their own lives. There was nothing of note in the car, and everyone said that the pair appeared to be happy and carefree, with no worries in life. Despite the police appealing for anyone who had seen either Margaret, Nicola, or their Suzuki Swift car between 3:50 p.m. on Thursday the 9th of May and Friday the 10th of May between 12:30 and 1 a.m., the fact that they had received information that the pair had been seen near Ballach, a 34-minute drive from their home in Paisley, in the early evening of Thursday the 9th of May, this information shed no light on the investigation. And even when a week and a half after Nicola had died, police officers turned up at Lindsay's home and removed her phones and laptops, despite this being odd, there were still no answers forthcoming. And the McDonough family were left devastated, bewildered, and in limbo. Margaret's 2 young foster children were placed with another foster carer. The remaining McDonough family moved out of the family home, unable to bear being in the home where their beloved sister and mother would never be again. The family home was put up for sale 6 months later, and still there was no explanation or reason why 2 compassionate and caring women would have taken their own lives. However, detectives doggedly continued to investigate and were determined to find answers for Margaret and Nicola's family. And on the 10th of May 2014, a year after the tragedy, finally the whole horrific truth began to come to light when 31-year-old mother of 2, Lindsay Cotton, was arrested and charged with obtaining money, goods and services by fraud, attempting extortion, and attempting to defeat the ends of justice in connection with the deaths of Margaret and Nicola McDonough, to which Lindsay Cotton initially pleaded not guilty. Despite being charged in May 2014, the trial wasn't scheduled to take place until September 2015. Due to further investigations being carried out, as Lindsay Cotton required to be assessed by a psychologist, and many witness statements were to be obtained, with 149 witnesses due to give evidence at the trial. But in the time between her arrest and the date of the trial in 2015, the true extent of Lindsay's fraudulent and horrifying scheme had been made public, and she was left with no option but to admit to fraud, to falsely threatening Margaret and Nicola with prison before their deaths, of conning Michael out of money and gifts, and to plead guilty and face her punishment. In 2012, 29-year-old Lindsay was a single mother who worked in a bar and lived in Addywell in West Lothian, which is about 19 miles or 30 kilometres west of Edinburgh, with her 8-year-old son Jack and 12-year-old daughter Lauren. Lindsay hadn't been very lucky in love, having been in a string of relationships with abusive and violent men. Her father had died 8 years prior, and she was still dealing with his loss, as well as suffering severe anxiety due to body image issues. So telling her children that she just wanted to find happiness, Lindsay decided to join a dating app to give finding love one more go. However, as she didn't feel very confident about herself, she decided instead of putting her own picture on the dating site, she would use a picture of her stepsister's daughter, who was a slim blonde in her 20s, who was called Stephanie Wilson. Lindsay not only decided to use her stepsister's picture on the dating website, but also her name. Having perused the dating website for months, making and receiving contact with men as Stephanie that she didn't feel were suitable, in May 2012, she then came across the profile and picture of Michael McDonough, and liking what she saw and read, she made contact with him as Stephanie Wilson. Over the course of a year, Lindsay and her fictitious character Stephanie extorted over £6,500 or $7,900 in cash from Michael, as well as, according to the Daily Mirror in April 2015, mobile phones, jewellery, household goods, appliances, services, and an engagement ring worth nearly £2,000 or $2,400. Lindsay, as Stephanie, would spend hours on the phone to Michael, having late-night conversations with him, working hard to hook him. And once he was hooked, she would frequently threaten to end the relationship if he didn't do what she wanted. Lindsay then concocted the story about Stephanie having been beaten up and having a bleed on the brain, requiring stem cell treatment, which she just so happened to have been accepted on a trial study for. But of course, ongoing financial assistance was needed from Michael for Stephanie to be able to stay on the trial. Then Lindsay introduced herself to Michael and the McDonough family as best friend and point of contact for the made-up Steph while she was undergoing confidential treatment. And so it went on. To enable Lindsay's fabricated story to be truly believed, she created a host of characters who would contact Michael and his family, from fictional Steph's dad, mum and 3 stepsisters, to a nurse, a doctor, government officials, a barrister, solicitors, and a judge. And according to the Daily Express newspaper in October 2015, over a 6-month period, Michael was bombarded with almost 35,000 text messages and instant messages from these creations via Lindsay using her 15 mobile phones, 2 laptops, and 2 tablet computers. Michael was completely worn down and completely at Lindsay's mercy. He had become engaged to Steph, had moved in with Lindsay, and would take Lindsay and her children on holiday at Steph's request. While Michael was thinking he was in a relationship with Steph and was becoming more and more stressed and anxious by the situation he found himself in, Lindsay was happily telling all her friends and family that she was dating Michael and that he had proposed to her and she would wear the engagement ring, even posting a picture of it on her finger on her Facebook page. As far as Lindsay's family were aware, Michael and Lindsay were a happy couple, living together and going on holiday together, with her mother saying in an article in the Mirror newspaper in September 2015 that, "I thought she had met somebody wonderful. They seemed to be in a great relationship and spent every leave he had from the RAF together, and I got to know him well. They looked like a wee family." Going on to say that she had also seen the white diamond engagement ring and thought they were engaged. So from Lindsay's family's point of view, Lindsay seemed to have it all and be quite happy. However, behind closed doors, Lindsay's fabricated stories about the fictional Steph became more and more elaborate, and eventually culminated in Lindsay embroiling Michael's mum Margaret and sister Nicola in her extraordinary story, and they, sadly, ultimately paid the highest price. Lindsay was with Michael when he received the news that Margaret and Nicola had been found and that they were both in a very bad way. And according to an article in the Mirror newspaper, Lindsay's mum said Lindsay seemed shocked and upset too. Following the sad death of both Margaret and Nicola, Lindsay, whose last threatening visit to the mother and daughter had led to them making the decision to take their own lives, attempted to delete and destroy all electronic information that related to her horrific scheme on her mobile phones, laptops and tablets, as well as destroying any paperwork she had. But she didn't do this alone. She enlisted Michael's help in doing this, as well as, according to an article in the Edinburgh News in April 2015, tried to have him provide a false account to witnesses and authorities to avoid detection and prosecution. But it's doubtful he knew the full extent of Lindsay's shocking scheme, and it's unknown exactly what she tried to get him to say. But alas, a week and a half after Nicola died in the hospital, the police arrived at Lindsay's property and seized her mobile phones, laptops and tablets. and despite it taking a year of investigation, her crimes were discovered, and she was arrested and charged. At Lindsay's trial in September 2015, 2 years and 4 months after Margaret and Nicola McDonough had been found unconscious with deep slash wounds to their arms, finally the whole unbelievable story behind what had led them to take their own lives was now laid bare for all to hear. All Lindsay's defence could say was, according to the BBC News in September 2015, that she expressed remorse and shame for what she had done, and that she felt for the upset and anguish she had caused the McDonough family, but that she had committed the crimes because she wanted to have a relationship with Michael, fearing that if he knew the truth, he would have no interest in her, and that finding love was her primary goal, and financial gain was only secondary. She was then taken away and remanded in custody to be sentenced. Her defence had asked that she be bailed to await sentencing instead of being remanded in custody, as she had 2 children and therefore was not a flight risk. However, this was refused as the case was deemed far too serious for her to be bailed. 33-year-old Lindsay Cotton appeared at Paisley Sheriff Court a month later, on the 8th of October 2015, to receive her sentence. However, before she was sentenced, the sheriff had a few things to say. According to an article in the Daily Express, Sheriff Robert Fife said to Lindsay, "I think the best word to sum up what you have done is cruel. Cruel to Michael McDonough, Margaret McDonough, and Nicola McDonough," going on to say that she had spun a complex and intricate web of deceit and lies and had placed extraordinary demands on the vulnerable family. And "I would describe your actions as deplorable, callous, despicable, and shameful." Despite the sheriff's clear feelings, which were mirrored by most people, Lindsay had not been charged in relation to the deaths of Margaret and Nicola, and so he felt it necessary to reiterate this in court, stating before he passed sentence that he could only sentence Lindsay for the charges she had pleaded guilty to. Lindsay, who wore no makeup and had her hair scraped back, was then sentenced to 3 years. The McDonough family now had to try and come to terms with what had happened and of losing 2 members of their family, and they wanted to be left alone to do that. Lindsay's mum, Isabel, said in an article in the Mirror newspaper that she may never be able to forgive her daughter for what she had done that had led to the 2 women taking their own lives, but that, "I don't blame her for everything. I don't think she was all to do with the deaths." She said that the whole family had been shocked by what Lindsay had done and had absolutely no idea about what was going on until after Lindsay was arrested. She went on to say that, "People are shouting 'murderer' at my grandchildren in the street." Lindsay's children at the time of the article in 2015 would have been 11 and 15 years old. Isabel says that Lindsay won't talk to her about what she has done, saying only, "Don't ask me about anything. I've made a big mistake." And then, in March 2016, less than 6 months after Lindsay had begun her 3-year sentence, she was found unwell in her cell and taken to hospital, where she died from a pulmonary embolism. So what do you think? Was 3 years long enough for what Lindsay had done? Should she have been charged with being involved in Margaret and Nicola McDonough's deaths? Lindsay's children were being shouted at in the street by people who believed she was a murderer. A sentence in an article in the Scottish Daily Mail in September 2015 read, "By tormenting the women with threats of prison and personal ruin, Cotton destroyed their lives as surely as if she had delivered the fatal blow herself." Does that sum it up for you? Should people who contribute to someone's death be charged with that? Or do you not feel that Lindsay should be labelled a murderer at all? Tell me what your thoughts are. As you likely know, the initial online scam Lindsay Cotton adopted was called catfishing, which is a deception that plays on emotion and romance and involves fake identities on social media. While the plot that Lindsay came up with was extremely outlandish, catfishing and internet crime is very real. But there are organisations out there, such as the Cyber Helpline, that can help anyone that feels they have been or could be a victim of online crime, or would just like more information.
Hi, I'm Charlotte from the Cyber Helpline, a charity created by the cybersecurity community to step in and fill a gap in support for victims of cybercrime and online harms. We provide a free confidential helpline for individuals and sole traders to help them to understand, contain, recover and learn from cyber attacks by linking them with cybersecurity experts who provide relevant advice and guidance. When talking to people online, trust your gut. If you feel like something is wrong, it probably is. Romance scammers' end goal is to obtain money, whether this is through getting you to send intimate images and then blackmailing you with them later, or asking you for money directly to help them with a tragic set of circumstances, or even encouraging you to make a financial investment. In some cases, they may even ask to send you money and have you transfer it somewhere else in a concept called money muling. They will often try and make the relationship serious fast, but they'll also take time to gain your trust. Some scams can go on for years, and it can often take weeks or months before they even ask for money. Reverse image searches may help you to check if the person is who they say they are, and asking them about local knowledge of areas that they say they're from, or pictures of them in front of local landmarks in these areas may help. But at the same time, if the person does want to meet in person, this may seem like a good sign, but ensure it's in a public place and let someone know where you are. Remember to be careful what you share, including phone numbers and email addresses. Keep contact within the app you had initial contact on as much as possible rather than moving the conversation elsewhere. Avoid sending money to people you don't know because it will be really tricky to get your money back. If you or someone you know has been impacted by romance scams or catfishing, there is support out there for you. Cyber criminals can be sophisticated and they aren't always easy to spot, so don't feel embarrassed, but make sure you get help in understanding if what's happening is a scam. Get support getting out of the situation safely, and make sure that you have emotional support in place. If you need help or support, you can access our chatbot, guides and helpline by visiting thecyberhelpline.com.
The Cyber Helpline is a not-for-profit, confidential organisation. It's run by volunteers and relies 100% on donations. Without your help, they wouldn't be able to provide a free service that supports victims of cybercrime. So, if you're able to give anything towards this fantastic and essential organisation, you can make a donation by going to thecyberhelpline.com/donate. Okay, so are you ready for another?
Dawn's Digest.
So I mentioned in this week's episode that Steph, or Lindsay, and Michael had met each other on the dating site Plenty of Fish in 2012. Well, as a strange but happy coincidence, and thankfully not a catfishing experience, I met my now husband Peter on Plenty of Fish in 2012 too. And speaking of my husband, Peter now has his own podcast, and as he's a software developer and his interests include Microsoft and related technology, funnily enough, that's what his podcast is about. Here's Peter to tell you more.
Keep current, keep coding with Rogue Planetoid podcast, where each episode you can find insights for developers, whether you are a beginner or an experienced professional using Microsoft and related platforms, along with related technology and so much more. You'll find us wherever you listen to your podcasts or at rogueplanetoid.com/podcast.
So if you or anyone you know are interested in these topics, you can listen to Rogue Planetoid podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Okay, just a wee shout out to Misty Dawn Decray, who is one of our The Belter tier patrons, and she has just received her exclusive Scottish Murders mug after 3 months of membership, and she says it's in pride of place on her desk. I'm so pleased you like it, Misty Dawn. This week, we received a lovely message from Nikki on Facebook saying that she loves the podcast and had initially started listening to episodes to go to sleep to. Thankfully, though, she does re-listen to the episodes once she is awake. It's not the first time people have said that they listen to our podcast to help them go to sleep, but like I said to Nikki, I'm taking that as a positive. Nikki went on to say that she finds the episodes interesting, full of facts, and she's kept entertained and wanting more, all while the episodes are kept respectful to the victims and their families. It means so much when people say that they find our episodes respectful. I've always said that it is ultimately the most important thing to me when telling each victim's story, being respectful. So thank you, Nikki. Nikki also said that she hopes we win at the True Crime Awards. But honestly, it would be an absolute dream to even be nominated. Scottish Murders has been entered into the category of Best Indie Podcast, and the judges, as we speak, are sifting through all of the entries to determine who should be nominated. So keep your fingers crossed for that one. But you, our listeners, can also help us by voting for Scottish Murders in the public vote for Top Podcast Listener's Choice by going to truecrimeawards.co.uk, clicking on the public vote, then Top Podcast Listener's Choice, and submitting your vote for Scottish Murders. We would be so appreciative, and I'll let you know when I know if we have been shortlisted for either award. Okay, so as this episode talks about cybercrime, catfishing in particular, and I mentioned the Cyber Helpline as being a free volunteer-based organisation that you can contact if you find yourself a victim of cybercrime, or if you would simply like to find out more, well, volunteers from the Cyber Helpline will also be at CrimeCon in London in June. So if you would like to ask them advice or receive more information in person, then you can speak to them confidentially there. CrimeCon in June is fast approaching. Have you got your tickets yet to the world's #1 true crime event, where you'll get inside the mind of serial killers and psychopaths, learn from leading criminologists, hear from the families and survivors, meet your favourite true crime podcasters, immerse yourself in forensic evidence, and delve deeper into unsolved crimes? As I've already said, Scottish Murders will be there, and we really hope to be able to meet as many of our listeners as possible. Don't forget to use the code SCOTTISH to claim a special 10% discount, and we hope to see you there. Okay, so here's a review from when Cole and I were doing the podcast together. It's from Beryl2, and they said, "The hosts of the show make it a true winner. The topics are both interesting and informative. The research and care taken in preparing the story for listeners is both respectful of the victims and engaging. They interrogate the facts by asking one another pointed questions designed to make sense of suspicious story points. I loved listening and hope you do too. Please listen, rate and subscribe." Thanks, Beryl2, and again thank you for saying that you found the stories respectful. I know I'm always asking you listeners to please leave us a review, as it helps others find the podcast, but I know on Spotify listeners are not able to leave a review, but you can leave a rating. So if you listen on Spotify, we would be so grateful if you could give us a rating, and if it was a 5-star rating, we would be even more grateful. It really does help others find the podcast, so thank you. Right, so that's about it for this week. There's only one thing left to do, and that's to tell you what April's theme is going to be. And it's going to be all about the money. And it was chosen by the Belter tier Patreon members. So thanks for voting, guys. If you would like to vote on what a future theme is, or which episodes we cover, would like to find out what's going on behind the scenes, or would just like to support Scottish Murders, then head over to patreon.com/Scottish Murders and become one of our wonderful patrons.
Scottish Murders is a production of Clurin Ton.